Hi, welcome back to part 4 of Getting into Graduate School, our ongoing series on how you can get into the graduate school of your dreams. Today's course is about getting a great letter of recommendation. Now, this is something that I think a lot of people get wrong, and so the 3 basic questions that we're going to cover today are who to ask, how to ask, and what to include in your ask. This is something that I feel really strongly about because I've been on all sides of this. As a graduate school applicant, as someone who's actually sat in on admissions boards, as a professor who's written letters of recommendation, as an employer who's written letters of recommendation and read letters of recommendation, and finally as a consultant who works with applicants looking to get into graduate school, I've seen this part of the application process from all sides of the equation. I can tell you as a professor, writing letters of rec is part of your job. So you'll do it, but the kind of letter you write isn't always a strong letter depending on the candidate. So you need to be able to identify whether or not a professor is going to offer you just a letter of recommendation or they're going to get a strong letter of recommendation for you. In my time working as a professor, I probably wrote 5 or 6 dozen letters over the years, and I know how to write and spot effective and powerful letters of recommendation as distinguished from a letter of recommendation that's just kind of meh. First question, who to ask? First point is that the writer, that is the person writing the letter of recommendation, should know you well enough to evaluate you and compare you to other students in your class and also other applicants. So one of the ways that I see people make a mistake here is that they'll often go for maybe a big name professor or just a professor that they got a good grade in, right? So they got a 500 person course in their freshman year and they got an A in it. And so I think this is the person that I should ask. But the problem is if you ever taught like a really big section like that, you don't remember people as a professor from years prior. So ask yourself when you go to get a letter of recommendation from someone, can they speak to your strengths and weaknesses? Have they seen you grow in important ways? So a lot of times if you've taken multiple classes, for example, with a professor, if you've had a boss or a supervisor who's had you for a number of years, if they can comment on how you've grown, that's a really important thing to look for. Can they provide a sense of texture and personality to their assessment? You can always tell when someone really knows an applicant if they include little stories, if they give you some vignettes into how they think, how they approach the world, who they are as a person, how they interact with other people. And to this point, can they tell a specific story about something that you did, something that you overcame, an accomplishment, something that is a concrete example and not just a list of attributes. Final point here, and it's always funny when I have to explain this to people, but it's important that the person who's writing your letter doesn't have any reason to be subjective. So I have read letters of recommendation from relatives. Your mom is not a good person to ask for a letter of recommendation. She's not going to be objective. So ask yourself this, is the nature of the relationship one where what they have to say doesn't carry any weight because it's too subjective. The best letters of recommendation come from people who have extensive and multiple opportunities over time to assess you and the work that you've produced. So how do you assess the stature of the person, right? So you want to get a letter of recommendation from someone who will impress an admissions committee. Again, I will repeat, this is not the most important factor. It's something to consider, but it's not the most important factor. A well-written and detailed letter from a lower-ranked professor or boss is much better than a perfunctory letter from some luminary or someone who has a fancy title. So that having been said, still think about, all things being equal, are they a leader in their field? Especially in the field that you're seeking to enter. Are they a name that the reader would recognize and respect? And also, it can sometimes be helpful if they're an alum of the school. So if you're applying to the University of Michigan and this professor that you have at, say, Cal Berkeley is a UMich alum in that program, they might have personal relationships and connections that will help. And so that can be something to consider. Now, this is kind of the Captain Obvious portion of the presentation, and that's how to ask. Now, I wish I didn't have to explain these things, but again, having been a professor, I know that people go about asking for letters of recommendation in terrible ways that actually undercut their ability to get a good letter from a letter writer. So this is kind of about the etiquette and how you go about approaching someone to write a letter of recommendation. So the first point is actually ask them. You would be shocked at the number of times that I would get an email, right? So someone who's applying to University of Chicago or something, I would just get an email in my box and say, Sally has listed you as a recommender for XYZ program. And Sally didn't ask me about it. That's not the right way to do it. Ask them. If you can ask them in person, it's better than doing it over the phone. And if you can ask them over the phone, that's better than over email. I know a lot of these things are a little bit different. It's a generational gap in some ways, but there's a specific reason that I'll talk about in a second why it's much better to ask someone in person for a letter of recommendation if you can. Now, look, if the recommender is in Harvard and you're in San Francisco, don't fly across the country just to ask them this, but if you're still in the same hometown, see them in person. If you can call them, do that. Secondly, be sure to thank them afterwards, even if it is part of their job as a professor. A handwritten note afterwards is a nice touch. One of the lessons that you may encounter when it comes to letters of recommendation is a lot of times you'll go back to that same person later on for another letter of recommendation for a fellowship or another job or something. And it's good if they want to help you. Your interactions with them have been so positive and so polite that they say, you know what, I actually do want to help Johnny. And so that makes a difference in the letter. Final point here on this, make sure that you give the person time to write the letter of recommendation. Typically 2 to 3 weeks before you intend to submit is a good timeline for the letter of recommendation. All right, so when you actually meet or contact the person, what do you ask for in your ask? So the first thing that I would always say is when you actually talk to the professor or the employer or whatever, be sure that you frame it in this way. Would you be willing to write me a strong letter of recommendation? All right? Again, as a professor, I have written letters of recommendation for mediocre to good students, and there's a way that I write those that are different than someone who is excellent. So if you say, would you be willing to write me a strong letter of recommendation? If they hesitate, or if they just flat out tell you, I'm probably not the person to come to for this, then you know that you should pick someone else. Second point, when you come to ask them for a letter of recommendation, provide them with your CV and whatever copy of your personal statement that you have, even if it's a draft. One good reason to ask for a letter of recommendation person is that your professor, your boss, or whoever it is that's writing, a lot of times will have questions, and your conversation with them will help them shape the letter so that it's a more powerful and effective letter for you. It's also useful if you can have some items, right? So maybe, a brief written statement for suggestions for some items that they might include, right? Give them maybe a brief sketch or reminders of things that you did under them and maybe other related accomplishments. And think specifically about the strengths that you hope the recommender highlights and provide them specific instances. So if you've been in their lab and you worked on a particular project, or if one paper that you wrote under them was really formative in terms of how you think about a topic, maybe you can bring them that paper and also briefly talk about how that was really important to you. Or if this is from a boss, say, look, I worked on these particular proposals or projects and it had this outcome, and I'm going to mention in my personal statement, it'd be nice if you could add these specific things. For example, right, you might say, my application really hits the theme that I'm a thoughtful risk taker who willingly embraces new ideas when they can solve problems. To back this up, would you be willing to write about how I worked with Samsung to solve XYZ problem? Right? So that's something you might say to your boss. Or if it's kind of more academic thing, you say, my personal statement, the theme that I'm really hitting on, or one of the themes, is that I want to explore how the history of British colonialism shaped the Conservative Party in England. Would you mention the paper that I wrote about Margaret Thatcher in South Africa, right? So again, you are helping to provide them with little nuggets and little snippets of information that will give their letter of recommendation depth and life and specificity, which really can help separate it from kind of the cookie cutter recommendations that a lot of professors will give. Finally, respect their process. Now, you can provide suggestions or help or tidbits, but at the end of the day, you're asking for a favor. And so try to accommodate them and be helpful to what it is that they're looking for. Every person will write their letter of recommendation, every professor, every boss in a different way. When I would write letters for students, I would sometimes ask the student, say, look, why don't you write a first draft of the letter? Send it to me, and then I would typically completely rewrite it. And so what their letter mostly was, I wanted to see what they highlight as important. And from that, I would pull stuff out and build a letter of recommendation. I'd also talk to them, right? So that I could get some real specificity and some meat on the bones there from the letter of recommendation. Some professors do this, others don't. Some professors will or other people will just say, look, write a letter of recommendation and I'll sign it. Everyone does it differently. That's not the best way to do the letter of recommendation in my experience. But again, you're working with their process and you are asking them for a favor. So within reason, try to accommodate their requests. All right. Here's my final big picture thoughts. 1, give your letter writers time and information so that they can write the best letter for you possible. 2nd, be polite, right? And help them help you. Again, provide information, insight, direction on where your application is going. 3rd point is think about who, how, and what to include so that your letter of recommendation aligns well and complements your application as a whole. All right. Letters of recommendation, a hugely important part of this process. So make sure that you give it some thought in terms of who you ask and how you ask, and remember to be polite, because there's a difference between the letter that you will get from an enthusiastic and excited professor who really wants to help you versus one who's like, this is part of my job. This guy was a little bit rude. I'm going to write him a 1-paragraph perfunctory letter that says, Johnny was a student in my class. He got a B+. He can probably complete graduate school, right? Again, help them help you. All right, that's all for today. Make sure you check back. Our next episode is how you go about contacting potential advisors. Contacting advisors is a really important part of this process and a lot of people forget. So check back with us. Make sure that you like and subscribe so that you get notifications for when the next episode comes. And again, peep our website, gurufi.com. That's Gurufi.com for help with all of your admissions essays across the full range of graduate schools. And if you have any questions about this series or anything related to graduate school admissions, please shoot us an email at service@gurufi.com. Once again, I'm Brian Phoebe, and I will see you next time.